listeners. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. I'm your host, Jana DeCristofaro. Today, we're delving into a topic that honestly, I didn't know much about before this conversation. So it's great that Jennifer Wiles, director of the Heart Play program in Massachusetts, agreed to come on the show and talk to us about how to support children with autism who are also grieving. When Jennifer and I first talked about the possibility of doing this episode, it was February. And thanks to schedules being what they are, it wasn't until this month, April, that we were actually able to record. And April is Autism Acceptance Month, which provides the perfect backdrop for this important conversation. Jennifer is a dance movement therapist and mental health counselor who has dedicated much of her career to supporting children with autism who are navigating grief and loss. Jennifer brings a wealth of knowledge about how to meet children where they are, honoring their individual ways of processing and expressing grief. We explore common misconceptions about children with autism and grief, practical strategies for supporting them through funeral rituals and disrupted routines, and creative approaches to grief expression that go beyond words. Whether you're a parent, a caregiver, or even a professional working with children who have autism, this episode offers insights into making grief support more accessible and more meaningful. One of Jennifer's biggest motivations in doing this work, as well as being on this episode, is to ensure that parents and caregivers of children with autism don't feel alone, especially when their kids are grieving. One note before we get started. After we hit stop recording, Jennifer wished she had mentioned one other resource that she finds valuable in her work, and that's a kid's book about grief, written by Brennan Wood, the executive director of Dougy Center, which is the program that produces this show. Okay, here's our conversation. Jennifer, thanks for making time to come be on Grief Out Loud.
Thank you so much, Jana. It's great to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background. What led you to be interested in focusing on supporting children and teens who have autism, who are also grieving? How did you get here?
Autism has always been a fascinating topic for me. I'm actually trained as a dance movement therapist and have spent a lot of my career and life working with people who are nonverbal or who have different ways of communicating and thinking about how we can express ourselves and connect with each other in ways other than words. So I was particularly drawn to people with autism for the challenge of making that connection in non-traditional ways. So in nonverbal ways, with movement and dance and music and other forms of expression, because I really feel like there's just a profound connection that can be made that way. That interest led me to build a whole dance movement therapy program in the greater Boston area, working with children with autism with dance and movement. And since then, working as a mental health counselor and running a grief support program for kids and families, this became a real interest of mine to be able to support people with autism in grief and loss.
I love how those two things sort of came together,
Yes.
These two interests of yours. And before we delve more into the conversation about supporting kids and teens with autism who are grieving, can you share a little bit about language? We talked a bit before we started recording of, what language are we using and why in this format?
I think this is a really important topic to discuss and to clarify. We've heard words like neurodivergence, neurotypical, neuroatypical, autism spectrum disorders, Asperger's syndrome, autism. And people will often ask me, how do I know which word to use? Which word is, correct or appropriate? And my answer is there is not one specific word. My rule of thumb is always to ask either the person involved or the family about which term they prefer. I think for the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to use the word autism because we're going to speak specifically about the nuances and the range of issues that may come up for this particular group of people. But I always say, too, if you feel like you've made a mistake when you are speaking to someone and perhaps use the wrong word, I think it's just great to apologize and move on. That the term isn't necessarily the most important thing. We also really want to be respectful of person first language. I know many folks are really aware of that, of the person first. So a child with autism rather than an autistic child, that everyone is a human being first.
And again, that's another area where it's so important to ask the people you're connecting with, right? Because there are so many folks who do prefer to say, I am an autistic person or I am autistic. And for this conversation, as to people talking in this sort of a grief professional realm, deciding to use kids and teens with autism. So just to acknowledge that that's kind of where we landed.
Yes, and thank you for that acknowledgement. I think that's really an important and respectful place to start as well.
So let's start with, what do you perceive are some of the common misperceptions or misconceptions that we have around how kids and teens with autism respond to or process grief? And we're talking about grief in this context, really around grief from a death loss.
So I think the most common perception is that sometimes these kids are not grieving. They don't care. They are not showing outward emotion, so that they are oblivious to the fact that there has been a death, or they are responding so strongly that it's thought to maybe be not about the death itself, but their own intolerance for the topic. So what I mean by that is that I think sometimes it takes these kids a while to fully understand the concept of death and what has happened, and to be able to process it and then to express it. But often there's this misconception that they don't care. They are not feeling this. They do not understand because they are not reacting in the ways that we typically think people might respond to a death loss. I think the other part of that, too, when I was saying about those strong reactions, and it's often in terms of a change in a schedule or a routine, that they often are responding more to that than to the actual event of the death. And with that comes that misconception that there's not a feeling about the death and the loss, but rather about the change in their routine.
It's reminding me of things that I've heard from parents and caregivers of kids of all ages, thinking particularly about maybe younger kids, where they hear that a parent has died, that someone tells them the news, and the first thing they say is, well, who's going to make my snack after school?
Right.
Right. And that as human beings, we're often like, how is this going to impact me personally, even on the day-to-day, before maybe even being able to touch into the emotional response or reaction to it?
I think that is so true. And it certainly is not specific just to kids with autism, is it? It's more a consequence of how is this going to affect me and impact me. I think sometimes kids with autism don't have that same filter of being able to articulate that in a way that is acceptable. So you're right. You're right. And many of the things I think we'll be talking about today do manifest in all kids or even all humans, really. It just sometimes is more apparent and overt in kids with autism.
You've spent a number of years working directly with parents and caregivers of kids who have autism. From that work and from your own personal experience, what are some of the ways that you see or have heard about grief and loss showing up for kids and teens with autism that maybe does stand out to folks as seems different or confusing or hard to read in some way?
Well, I think there's the very public face of death often. All of a sudden, maybe a family is in the public eye. Maybe there's a lot of people, say, in and out of the family home. Maybe there is a public event such as a funeral or a memorial service or a celebration of life. So the privacy that often families really do need in order to fully care for a child with autism is all of a sudden taken away. And there's this very public facing experience of death. And often for the kids that we're talking about today, there is a very low tolerance for those public events, for that interaction with so many strange people and all the sensory changes that can bring, the noise, the smells, the different food maybe that's around, people wanting to hug you and talk to you and interact with you. All of those things can be really upsetting. And I would say dysregulating. I think that is one thing I've noticed over the years with families. It's how to merge these two events, the very maybe private and isolated sometimes life that they have with their child, and then to be in a very public facing event or space.
Yeah, and the demands that come with those public facing events of people wanting to connect with you or offer comfort and solace, which oftentimes is because that's what they need, not necessarily what the person that they're trying to support and comfort is needing. There's a lot of additional social, physical demands on folks.
Oh, absolutely. And so that has been one of the many focuses of my work is to prepare a child or a family for an event like that, like a funeral, a wake, a memorial service. So working with them about what to expect and trying to prepare them for different situations, which as concrete thinkers, it might be difficult for them to reconcile. Some of the ways that I have done that is to write social stories, which for people who are familiar with autism is a wonderful time-tested way of communicating, where social situations are broken down into very simple steps to help explain to the child what might happen and to make these complex social situations, which every social situation is pretty complex when you think about it, but to make it more manageable, to anticipate certain things that might come up and to maybe hopefully prepare them for what to expect. For example, this has come up a few times at, say, a wake or a shiva where people are gathered. And as people gather, perhaps they are telling stories about the person and thinking about memories of the person. And as people talk more, maybe they're laughing and kind of joking and remembering something happy. So that laughter and that the smiles can be very confusing to a concrete thinker. Why are these people laughing and joking? This is sad. This is supposed to be sad. We are all sad. So difficult to reconcile that complex thing. So I break it down into steps. This is what people do sometimes. So this is something you can expect. And people might say things to you like, I am so sorry for your loss. Who of us has not heard that before? But tricky to think about those words for a concrete thinker. So here are some things you can say or you can sign to say thank you.
What are suggestions do you have for parents, caregivers, family members of how to even deliver the news to kids and teens with autism that someone in their life has died?
Thank you for asking that question. And here I would say it's the same advice that we as bereavement professionals say all the time, which is be honest, be concrete, be specific. Don't use euphemisms like he's gone, we've lost him. It's like she's asleep. She just went on a long trip. She's up in the stars, right? We've all heard these. It just creates more confusion, especially for concrete thinkers. We need to be, again, direct, clear, honest, and concrete. Again, a social story could come into play here, where we talk about what death means, and to be very concrete about what that means physically. The body is no longer working. That means the heart no longer beats. This person will not talk, walk, eat, breathe again, and we will not see them alive again. And I know that sounds very blunt and almost harsh, but in that way, it's a definite, concrete thing that the child can then ask more questions about. And then I think there's also the emotional component of what they can expect. I am going to be sad. People will be sad. That means you might see me crying. That means we might be busy. That means we might not eat dinner at 6 o'clock tonight. Kind of those concrete things that we mentioned before that would impact their routine. But I think that's the place to start. And as I said, I don't think that's very different from the advice that we often give to any family to explain a death to a child.
In your work with the parents and caregivers, are there questions that their kids have asked them about the death or about grief that have stood out to you as being either helpful for those adults or maybe more challenging for those adults to answer?
I think a challenge that comes up, and again, I've heard this with families with kids who are not autistic too, is what we call that perseveration, that kind of repetition over and over again of the same question. Where is daddy? Where is he? And then 10 minutes later, where is he again? So just that repetition, I think, can be really tricky. And also, of course, upsetting to that surviving parent or that grieving parent too, right? That they have to keep reopening that wound or that really painful place to keep going back to it.
The second part of that question was wondering, with the parents and caregivers you've worked with, are there things that they have learned from supporting their kids and teens that have helped them in their own grief? When I think of kids and teens often being teachers to us.
I think so. Jana. I think that often the adult parent is compelled to name their own emotions and to label their own experience, to really own that in a very concrete way in order to communicate that with their child. So I think there's a process that many parents go through of how much do I keep inside? How much do I show my child that I am upset, that I am grieving, that I'm uncertain, scared, lonely, afraid, anxious, whatever the case may be, or how much do I shield them from the emotions I'm feeling? And I think it does compel parents to get down to the core of what they're feeling, to learn to label their emotions and to break them down in a way that their child will understand. Something as simple as, I'm feeling sad today, I miss mommy. And even showing, so you might see this sad look on my face, you might see a tear in my eye. That means I'm sad and I miss mommy. So getting to the core of their experience and communicating that in a concrete way to their child, I think often helps. And there's a sense of almost leaning into those hard feelings and that pain in a way that shows the child, I am here for you and I am human at the same time.
It seems like an interesting convergence of both motivation and permission, right? Motivation to acknowledge and communicate what parents and caregivers are experiencing, but then also inherent in that is maybe some permission to have those feelings or show those feelings or explain those feelings to their kids and their teens.
Yes, and I think a certain aspect of communicating with people with autism is to keep it very structured. So we break it down into smaller, more manageable bits. I think that's a helpful technique for anybody, honestly. These big emotions of grief, we talk about the waves of grief, these big feelings washing over us. And if we can somehow break it down into more manageable pieces, that I think that's helpful to all of us. A particularly profound aspect of the grieving experience for families with a family member with autism, too, is just the accumulated grief and losses that have happened over their lifetime before the death has even occurred. And this is a theme that comes up often with the caregivers that I work with, is that there have been so many losses along the way, not necessarily death losses, of course, but losses that lead to this point of grief. For example, loss of friendships. Maybe their child cannot tolerate, the big birthday parties and the big community get-togethers and the playground even, where typically, parents, caregivers can connect. that doesn't often happen. Those invitations stop coming, even with family members and family celebrations and holidays. Um, Often these families are not participating in those things. And then as the children grow, maybe they're missing those typical milestones that people are celebrating, everything from getting your driver's license to, graduation to going to college, or any of those things that maybe families really look at as milestones to be celebrated are also almost brief anniversaries for some of these families. So by the time a death happens, they're very familiar, I think, with that feeling of grief and loss and the many accompanying emotions and experiences that come with it. It strikes a certain chord in these families, and it strikes deeply.
Our show is so focused on death loss, or, occasionally we'll have episodes with people who are dealing with an advanced serious illness and maybe facing a death loss in the future. And also, all of those death losses occur in the context of hundreds of thousands of non-death losses over the course of life, too. So I appreciate you kind of bringing that into the conversation, and that for some folks, there may be more familiarity with their own grief from those non-death losses, so that when a death loss occurs, there can be, there's this familiarity. And for some folks, it can be, I thought I knew how I was going to grieve because I've grieved all these other losses, but this one is just so different and requiring a different response from me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another loss that I would name too for this particular group of people is pet loss. And when I say that, I mean often a service animal, the death of a service animal, which is such a strong bond for many of the young people we work with. That animal is their bridge to human connection. Often, that's the purpose of some of the service dogs, to be that bridge to social contact with other children and other people. Everyone can look at the dog, pat the dog, they can talk about the dog, right? And of course, sadly, animals do not often live as long as humans. And that death is a significant part of a child's development when that service animal dies. I mean, it is deep grief. And I know we focus on human death, but I thought that would be important to mention in this conversation too, because not just a pet, but really, this companion, their bridge to the outside world.
We've talked a bit about how important routine and predictability and consistency is for kids and teens with autism. It's also something we talk about for all kids who are grieving, how important those routines can be in terms of reestablishing a sense of safety. Are there particular suggestions you have for families, knowing that there can be a lot of short-term disruptions to routine, but then there can also be these longer-term disruptions too, in terms of helping with that transition?
Yes, I think that's true. As we know, death is so inherently disruptive on so many levels to a family's life. So I would say it's important to name that change in routine, that routines are going to be disrupted no matter the best of intentions. It's probably going to not be as consistent as it always is. I would say, one, to call on other family members to pitch in to uphold those routines as much as possible. I would say, two, to give a little leeway for the child, to just maybe be a little bit more lenient about bedtime or meal times, going to school on time, whatever the case may be, to give a little bit of leeway for that. I will also say again that just because the child is reacting in a big way to some of these changes, and maybe a catastrophic way, we sometimes say, it doesn't mean that they don't care about what's going on. This is their stress reaction. This is what they lean on to feel comfortable and safe in the world. And when that is disruptive, it's a big deal to them. So all the things that we might see in terms of a big reaction to a change in routine to maybe more of the self-stimulating behavior, perhaps the flapping, the jumping, the perseverating on words, to an intense and increased interest in one of their particular foci of interest, whether that's a fan in the ceiling or the air conditioner or whatever the case may be. Those are coping skills. And I think it's important to frame it that way instead of steering them away from that behavior, noticing it that this is what it is. This is their way of coping and their way of processing what has happened and their way of managing their own anxiety around these changes. I think, too, when entering a public space, say a funeral, a wake, whatever the case may be, that there is a schedule that you really reduce your expectations of how long the child will participate in things like that, and to call on, again, on a trusted family member or friend to take the child away. That it's better to kind of quit those situations while you're ahead rather than to make sure they're there to the bitter end of the service or to the last moment till the last person has left the funeral home. You want to rely on some network of people, and often maybe it's not family, maybe it's a teacher from their school, maybe it's someone from the funeral home, maybe it's a neighbor. It could be someone that you don't necessarily think of as family, but can be part of that support network.
Yeah, maybe somebody who's less likely to feel like they really want to stay for whatever's happening in the service, right? To have less of a connection so that if they are the person who's going to go be with a child or a teen in another room or another environment, that they won't have as much of a personal disconnect from what's occurring.
That's a great point. That's a great point, that they are there for that one job almost to be a support to that person. And I would also say, for families to be proactive about this with, say, the funeral home, to name this situation beforehand, to not just kind of show up that day and say, oh, by the way, my child is here. But often funeral homes will really work so kindly with the family to make sure there's a quiet space for the child to go, perhaps even some materials that they can use, some books, some coloring books. We have worked with funeral homes to have comfort kits there with noise canceling headphones, with some comfort toys, some fidget items, things like that. So I would say be proactive when you can to prepare people who are not familiar with your child to be able to support them in different spaces.
I wanted to go back, Jennifer. Earlier in the interview, you talked about how, you're a trained dance therapist, dance movement therapist, and that one of the things about that is being able to express in nonverbal ways. And I was thinking about how much we rely on words and verbal processing and verbal expressions to understand what kids and teens are feeling in their grief and what they're needing in their grief. And a number of the families that you work with have kids who express themselves not with words. And just wondering, what are some of the ways that you have seen grief be manifested non-verbally, and what are suggestions you have for supporting that?
Yes, thank you for asking this question. I think it's a really important one. The project that I've been involved with for a number of years now is called Expanding the Language of Grief. And literally, there are so many ways to express grief besides words. Using movement, we often will work with gestures or movements to help us remember the person. So one exercise that I have done many times is based on sensory memories. As we might know, kids with autism often have an amplified sensitivity to the different senses and stimulation from those senses. So maybe they're particularly sensitive to noise or to smell or to even visual stimulation. Again, we are using that sensitivity as a strength So we think about different ways we might remember our person through the senses. In other words, for sight, what did your person look like, or what was their favorite color? So we'll do color. So for favorite color, we can point around the room to everything that is blue in the room. And then maybe your favorite color, point to all the things and that can become a dance, right? Of pointing to different things. The hearing, I know one person remembered their mom reading to them. Of course, food's always a big one to remember, is the food, the smell. One little girl smelled the flowers and she went for a walk with her mom. So you understand what I'm saying. So instead of just talking, we are moving. And then what we do sometimes is make a dance with all of these gestures put together. And in a way, it's a tribute to their person and to those memories. Put it to music, maybe to a favorite song that the child likes. Maybe it's just to a rhythm. But that's kind of a concrete way of using movement, music, dance, to really embody those beautiful memories. And not a word is spoken.
I love all that. And I have to admit to getting a little anxious when you said, and then we can make it a dance as a dance-averse person. I was like, please don't make me do that.
Well, I mean, a dance can look like anything. Like I said, the dance of just pointing to different objects in the room, right?
Thank you for being accommodating for my dance aversion.
Yes, Jana, we will not make you dance. Another thing that I sometimes do is incorporate rocking. I think we know for many people with autism, that's a very soothing activity, a soothing movement to literally rock back and forth. And as I mentioned, sometimes when there is a death and things are disruptive and a little chaotic, maybe those self-stimulating behaviors become even more amplified. So that rocking back and forth might increase. But that's a nice way to even start moving together, just rocking back and forth, and maybe working in some of the repetitive movements with that. So that can become kind of a soothing, rhythmic activity that kids sometimes like. Another one is drumming and rhythm. We know that rhythm and consistency is very grounding and centering and regulating for people. That rhythm of life, right? The heartbeat. We know that's a consistent rhythm for all of us. And it helps us when things feel chaotic to come back to that consistent rhythm. So we do use drumming a lot with kids to calm, to center, and to focus.
Those are such helpful, amazing suggestions, and appreciating all the ways that it accommodates different expression, but also tapping into like what's someone's instinctive way of self-soothing or coping. For any of us, I think about like what are our natural go-tos, and how can those then be incorporated into or reframed as, oh, this is someone expressing their grief in a way that feels soothing to them.
Absolutely. And thank you for picking up on that. I think the major approaches with dance movement therapy just resonate so well with the grief work. So we always believe in ritual of starting or ending a session with ritual. So it's a very expected part of the session, that they know this is the start of the session and this is the end of the session. And speaking with so many caregivers of people with autism, I think parents of all kids, that bedtime routine is so important, that consistency, knowing what we do every night before we go to bed, etc. That's just the fabric of our daily lives often is ritual. So that's really important. And then again, with dance movement therapy, there's this attunement piece. We talk about attunement, really witnessing the person, really noticing where they are, observing their posture, their gestures, their stance, their energy, tuning in, literally attuning to them. And then we talk about mirroring, which is not mimicking what they're doing, but picking up on those movements and doing them with the person in moving together with the same movement. Again, you're saying, I see you, you matter. I am witnessing you and I am with you in this space. So it's not a making fun of or mimicking, it's a moving together, that mirroring. That's real validation for people to feel seen and heard. And then we talk about kinesthetic empathy. That feeling, I am with you, we are moving together, I am feeling what you are feeling in my own body. So there's this real connection there. And we talk about the therapeutic movement relationship that comes with that, of moving together rhythmically, of being witnessed and seen, of actually feeling those similar feelings empathically together. So that makes up a lot of our sessions too. And you can see those concepts really are part of, as I said, the fabric of all of our lives. That's how we connect as human beings. It's just sometimes a little different when someone is not verbal or has different ways of communicating.
One thing I'm wondering about, Jennifer, we talked about the rhythm of just our emotional expression and the rhythm in the dance connection, the kinetic interaction with someone. I'm also thinking about the rhythm of the calendar when it comes to grief. So
Yeah.
Birthdays, anniversaries, other significant days. What suggestions do you have for parents and caregivers in supporting kids and teens with the approach of those significant days and the actual event of those significant days?
Yes, this is a question that comes up all the time for almost every family, honestly. And I think it's really important to discuss. I will often say it's often probably a good idea to have a plan, even if you decide that day to scrap the whole plan. I think it's good to mark it. I think with kids with autism, it's good often to keep it very short, simple, and manageable, but to take a moment to mark that day in some way. It could be something as simple as lighting a candle together as a family, or often families in our programs, will make a simple luminary with even a piece of vellum paper in a cone with a tea light inside of it, right? Just something very simple, but that act of doing it together, of almost, quote, ritualizing it. Other families I know will do something as simple as, throwing a stone into the water, just something, even just taking a moment to name the person or to sign the person's name, to look at a picture, to somehow mark that day. I think it's important to have a mark in time about it. But again, keep it simple, manageable, something that everyone can participate in.
As we come to the end of our conversation, Jennifer, I'm curious, what resources would you recommend for families who are looking for more support with kids and teens who have autism and who are now dealing with grief too?
Thank you so much for asking this. I would say my number one resource that I recommend is through the National Alliance for Children's Grief. We have developed a toolkit there that you can access through their website, nacg.org. It's a toolkit for supporting children of all abilities who are grieving, and it has different sections in it. There is a resource section there. There is a section on frequently asked questions. There is a section on activities that you might want to try, and there's a section on best practices. So some of it, might apply more to a bereavement professional, but certainly many parts of it could be used by families and caregivers. There's a couple books that I have found really helpful over the years. There's a series of books called I Have a Question About ... And there are 3 of them in that series that I know of: divorce, cancer, and death. And the authors, Meredith Polsky and Arlen Gaines, have used graphics very similar to that used when we're writing the social stories, these kind of pictogram graphics. again, breaking down these complex situations in ways that I think are very responsive to the needs of children with autism. Asking those questions: what is death? What happens when somebody dies? What can I do now? Those sad feelings. How can I go to school? Very concrete questions. I have had a really good response from that book. There is understanding death and illness and what they tell us about life. That is, I would say, for maybe older kids, where hundreds, I think, of topics are explained in a very concrete way in paragraph form. And then there's a series of questions and check-in questions that follow each short paragraph of the topic. And it's anything from what does it mean when someone says pass away, to what happens when someone is very sick? How will I know if someone is at the end of their life? What does death mean? Very, very concrete questions and very concrete answers. That book is by Catherine Faherty, Faherty.
And how about your own work, Jennifer? If listeners are like, I want to connect more with Jennifer and hear more about what she's doing, where can they find you?
Oh, thanks for asking. So I am the director of the Heart Play program, and we have a website that lists lots of resources for people with autism and grief. We have social stories that folks can download on the topics of what is death, what is grief, what to know about attending a funeral, and other topics that you can access on our website at no cost. And we also have a number of support groups that are available to you. So please be in touch with me. Our website is heartplayprogram.org, HEARTPLAY program.org. And I think that's probably the best way to reach me.
Well, that's great, Jennifer. I will, listeners, I do this, but I'll link all of the resources, including Heart Play Program and the books that Jennifer just mentioned, which I need to go get because I definitely have a lot of questions and I want to check out these books. So that'll all be in the show notes, listeners. Jennifer, thank you for making time to have this conversation, for sharing so much of your personal experience and your professional experience and just your insight and wisdom about this topic of supporting kids and teens with autism who are grieving. I'm just really thankful for this time today.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak about this work, and for people who are listening to it for paying attention to this topic. Thanks so much.
And listeners, I say this to you each and every time, but thank you for being part of our community. A few of you have emailed me recently, and I so love hearing from you. So if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org. That's our main website where you can find all the information about Dougy Center's local programs, all of our tip sheets, activity sheets, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. The show is sponsored in part by the Chester Steffen Endowment Fund, and Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families located in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.